Hello and welcome to the web panel of the Delphi Economic Forum on latest developments in the Eastern Mediterranean. My name is Ioannis Grigoriadis and I am an associate professor at Bilkent University, Ankara, and a senior researcher at the Hellenic Foundation for European Foreign Policy. I'm honored to moderate a panel on a very interesting moment, which is the pandemic moment. It is the pandemic crisis that has affected our lives in so many fundamental ways, and it's also affected politics in the Eastern Mediterranean region. I'm delighted to have with me today 4 distinguished experts that will discuss with us their views on how the latest global developments have affected politics in the Eastern Mediterranean. So, in alphabetic order, we have Thanos Dokos, alternate National Security Advisor to the Greek Prime Minister, Nathalie Tocci, Director for the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome and a Honorary Professor at the University of Tübingen, Sinan Ülgen, Executive Chairman of the think tank EDAM in Istanbul, and Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council in the United States. So, I would like first to give the floor in alphabetical order to Thanos Dokos. Thanos, what do you think that is the most profound effect of the pandemic crisis on politics of the Eastern Mediterranean?
Well, first of all, it's good to be in a panel with friends, although we're not in physical proximity. But that's at least a substitute. Well, the first thing I see is empty airports, empty hotels, and empty beaches at a time where that shouldn't be the case. And that goes for a number of countries which will be hurt by the pandemic. Hopefully, it will not be a lost season for all of us, but it remains to be seen. What I see in terms of security developments, business as usual, and I'm not saying that in any positive way. The Mediterranean continues to be a contested space. Probably it looks more like a G0 region. Multiple state and non-state actors are active, but no one seems to be in charge. And especially those that are of most interest to a country like Greece, which is the EU, it has a strategy. And Nathalie played a fundamental role in preparing this, but we don't seem to be active players, at least not as much as we should be. There's too much disagreement, reflection, but little action on the part of the EU. So we are, well, not exactly observers, but close to that. And as far as the US goes, well, we have the health crisis, the economic crisis as a result of that, the Floyd affair, the elections coming, the escalation of the relationship with China. All this means that little US leadership is expected in the Eastern Med. Now, and we have, unfortunately, a long list of problems. Libya, the fighting has escalated. No good solution in sight. Hopefully, there will be an understanding between the two fighting sides, but that is not the case as we speak. Syria continues to be a problem. Fortunately, limited flows, migration and refugee flows although Italy remains a factor which could change things. Energy, which has been a very contentious issue over the past few years in the Eastern Med, there seems to be a slowdown in the activities of companies, perhaps because of the very low prices of hydrocarbons. But we still have tension. And coming to perhaps my last point, there is high tension between Greece and Turkey. We had the Evros crisis in March. There seems to be escalating situation as we speak because of delimitation of maritime zones and possible exploration of hydrocarbons. Not the kind of relationship one would have expected, especially as the COVID-19 crisis is still unfolding. And one could have expected perhaps a bit more cooperation from countries in the region to try to get out of this crisis with as little damage as possible. That's not what we have seen so far. So the Eastern Med is still in a very fluid situation. No regional security architecture. We had the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum established some time ago. Perhaps the basis of a regional security architecture, of course, there is an important ingredient missing, and this is Turkey. It has difficult relations with many other regional countries, but perhaps we should try to think out of the box and find ways to cooperate and integrate Turkey into what is happening in the Eastern Med. Not easy, but the situation will remain incomplete as long as we have this conflicting relationship. So let me stop at this point and Ioannis,
thank you very
back
much,
to you.
Thanos. Thank you. Nathalie, you've been instrumental in promoting this discussion on European security strategy. So how do you look into the developments in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the context of the pandemic? Of course, the pandemic is a security crisis of another dimension, but the Eastern Mediterranean was already a region where several security crises were unfolding when the health security crisis developed. So what is your take on the current state of affairs?
Well, I think I very much start in the same way as Thanos did, in part that especially in a post-COVID-19 East Med, this really does look like a G0 world. Now, and often what is said about COVID-19 is that it tends to accelerate dynamics. I think in this particular case, it both accelerates one set of dynamics as well as possibly reverses others, particularly if we look at the East Med from a global perspective. Now, I think it accelerates a US departure from the region. It has not caused it, but in the context of COVID-19, the United States has not exactly excelled at global leadership. And what I found most striking about it is that it is not a question of the US being opposed. It is far more a question of the United States being missing in action at the global level. And I think that, as I said, it's not something that began with COVID-19, particularly if we think about the East Med. We as Europeans, for instance, we as Italians have been kind of asking the United States to be, for instance, more involved in Libya. And the United States has been telling us that it has absolutely no intention of doing so. It has been very clear the way in which the United States has not been particularly active in Syria, and therefore the way in which a US, I wouldn't say disengagement, because the presence of the United States, particularly when it comes to the Middle East, perhaps less so in the Mediterranean, is still there, but it's a presence that is less able to effect outcome. So it's a presence that does not automatically translate into power. Now, in this respect, you could see COVID-19 accelerating these trends. On the other hand, And this is perhaps slightly more speculative, but I also think that a post-COVID-19 is going to see less China in the Eastern Mediterranean. And what I mean by this is that if it is true that globalization is going to change in nature, that we're going to see shorter global supply chains, we may well end up seeing a globalization which is more regional, a more regionalized globalization. And in a more regionalized globalization, this will obviously impact, possibly quite heavily, the whole ethos and feasibility of the Belt and Road, which of course had been the main initiative, the main geo-economic and geostrategic initiative through which China had pushed westwards, including in the Eastern Mediterranean. So if basically you have the sort of two major global powers, which are, I wouldn't say completely absent from the scene, but with reducing influence on the region, then obviously one asks oneself what is left. Now, what is left is Europe and the regional players. Now, the problem, of course, is that, and as Thanos was very much pointing out, and I very much agree, Europe has certainly been fairly clear on what its overall strategy and objectives are. I don't think there's, frankly speaking, a lot of work that needs to be done in order to refine that further. The main problem when it comes to the European Union is that it has been up to it in terms of implementing that vision, both in terms of acquiring the necessary capabilities of being more present and, above all, sort of garnering the will in order to act. And this has been very clear if we take, for instance, Libya, the way in which, in the context of Libya, absent United States, present in words but not in action, European Union, largely because of our divisions, but I wouldn't say it's only about our divisions. I think it's largely due to our unwillingness to actually put not our perhaps money in this case, but our boots where our mouth is. And this has obviously left a void, and it's a void that, as we know very well, has been filled by regional players, beginning with Russia, with Turkey, UAE, and of course, Egypt as well. Now, at this point, if we take the case of Libya, what's our best bet? Well, it's kind of one of these situations in which it almost becomes a bit too late for us to take decisive action. We almost have to hope that Russia and Turkey, two regional players, end up coming to a compromise, which is not going to be our compromise, because it seems very clear to me that the only compromise that they might be interested in is one of freezing a conflict rather than resolving it. But of course, freezing a conflict is better than having an active conflict. So the question really is whether that push in Libya is going to eventually be stronger than a UAE Egyptian push to have an all-out victory of Haftar, but assuming that a Russia-Turkey push is strong enough to have a ceasefire, which, as I said, would not be intended to peace, the question is whether the European Union would be able to get into the nooks and crannies of that relationship in order to then eventually shift it towards a more constructive direction. In order to do so, of course, words are insufficient. It is very clear that in order to do so, action is necessary. And as I said, it has to be a willingness not only to talk autonomy, but to do autonomy as well. So this is when it, as far as, if you like, the EU's general approach, and one could apply it to different situations, obviously, in the East Med. I just took the Libya case as an example here. The second point and last point that I wanted to raise is really one about the way in which the European Union understands these regional relationships. Now, it is very clear that, which are the regional players that we're talking about. We're clearly talking about, in for instance, Turkey, Iran, Russia, sort of slightly lower in terms of, if you like, regional significance, Israel, UAE, Egypt. And it is very clear that unless the EU is able, not only through its bilateral re-understanding and reconstruction of those relationships re-understanding, a reconstruction of those relationships, attempt to affect the regional dynamics between these players, it is going to be unable to play a meaningful role. And I think this, and I'll only pick the Turkey case because in many respects it is, I think, the most significant, and also because I wouldn't have time to go through all of them. But I really do think that the time has come for the EU to change its lens when it looks at Turkey. It is very clear that there is a necessary change of lens when it comes to migration. What happened at the beginning of this year, in many respects, highlights the fact that what has been a Turkish threat, or rather an Erdogan threat vis-à-vis migration to Europe, is of course to an extent meaningful, but to a large extent empty. In a sense, we know that the emperor has no clothes. And therefore allowing this relationship to just develop in a transactional manner, ultimately because of a fear that the EU has had since 2015, has on the one hand not served the European Union well, and on the other hand has revealed to be largely empty. Second change of lens when it comes to Turkey is really reconsidering what is a gift and what is not a gift. And understanding that some things that we understand as being a gift to Turkey, such as, for instance, moving towards a modernized customs union, are not actually a real gift. Well, they are a gift to Turkey, they're not a gift to Erdogan. But so long as we understand them as a gift to the Turkish president, we're going to be, if you like, victims of our own analysis and our own understanding of the situation, and essentially be giving Erdogan the ultimate gift that he wants, which is essentially that of saying that he should move in a constructive direction with the European Union, but not acting to that effect. And then third, and obviously related to this, a change of lens in really separating and making the distinction of what is Erdogan and what is Turkey. And understanding that the interests of one and of the other actually do not always and necessarily coincide. And when we develop our policies towards Turkey, and develop policies towards Turkey and not merely towards Erdogan. Now, the reason why I put so much emphasis on Turkey, and this is where I'll end, is because if it is true that the United States is progressively disengaging itself from the region, and therefore in many respects, we will have a Turkey which is increasingly unmoored in the region. And it is no coincidence that over the last years, we have seen Russia particularly essentially using this unmooring of Turkey to its own advantage. So if there isn't a United States which basically reins Turkey in because of its own changing global leadership role, then it is very clear that unless the European Union does it, Turkey simply not keep on only doing what it's always done, which is basically act in a very transactional sort of lone wolf way, but because ultimately the, if you like, balance of power between Turkey and Russia is so much skewed towards the latter, ultimately the overall direction this is going to take is certainly not going to be to the EU's advantage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. Sinan, Nathalie spoke about the unmooring of Turkey from the West or from the United States. And Turkey is involved in virtually all the issues, the disputes that have been transpiring in the Eastern Mediterranean. So what is your evaluation of the current state of affairs? Is Turkey really overplaying its hand by getting engaged into too many disputes at the same time? Is there an opportunity for resolving or sort of freezing conflicts and bringing Turkey closer to its European neighbors and the European Union?
First of all, many thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here with friends. Now, in order to really understand and to conceptualize where Turkey stands today, I think it's useful to take a look at the evolution of Turkish foreign policy over perhaps the last 5 years. What we see increasingly, I mean, the terminology that Nathalie has used was, being unmoored. Yes, there's definitely some of that. That is not a new phenomenon in the sense, especially with regard to Europe, there is such a disillusionment with Europe that at the political level, the unmooring had already happened quite some time ago. You see that very clearly, that despite paying lip service to accession, right now the EU has absolutely no leverage on Turkish behavior. And that stands in stark contrast to the state of relationship when a decade ago the accession relationship was on track and the negotiations were ongoing. So within a decade we very much moved in a very different position, and so the unmooring already happened. Secondly, what we also see in the last few years, and this is something that traces back to the conflict in Syria, is a proclivity for the Turkish leadership to shift to a mode of hard power. Now, traditionally, Turkey, at least at the beginning of the decade, put much more emphasis on soft power, so much so that if we go back again 10 years ago, at the onset of the Arab Spring, there was talk about the Turkish model, and that was, par excellence, the soft power of Turkey. Today, we live in an environment where the Turkish leadership actually emphasizes the hard power component. This, to some extent, was by necessity in Syria, as Turkey got exposed to the security spillovers from Syria and became entangled with the conflict in Syria, but increasingly also by choice. And this is what we see in Eastern Mediterranean and Libya. The interesting part also here is that this choice of conducting foreign policy on the basis of hard power also seems to have captivated the support of the Turkish domestic opinion, public opinion. So it is something more than purely government policy. It is something that has indeed received support, especially since Turkey seems to have won zones of influence or achieved at least some of its ambitions in a geography like Libya, with a minimal investment in its hard power, but in return getting quite a bit of political influence on the ground. So I think this is the trend that needs to be underlined as we're watching where Turkey is moving. And I think the implications for Europe in terms of what to do next in the post-COVID environment are twofold. One, and here I would very much second Nathalie's thoughts, is that we really have to review the framework of the relationship between Turkey and the EU, because right now this is a very dysfunctional relationship. It's become only a transactional relationship. And as a result, the EU has lost really all leverage. This is something that I've tried to outline before as well. So if the EU wants to have an impact on Turkish behavior, whether it is in the Eastern Mediterranean, whether it's in Libya, whether it has to do on Cyprus and so on, or even the bilateral issues with Greece, there really needs to be a time to rebuild this relationship into something more positive. So we really have to enrich this relationship, and here I'm not even talking about the goal of accession that can remain or that can, be debated, but fundamentally we have to enrich the relationship with some positive aspects. Right now, the way that Ankara looks at the EU is basically, either, a source of money for the refugees, but very little else for the time being, because all the tracks of movement in this relationship have stalled. The accession has stalled, customs union has stalled, visa liberalization has stalled, and so on and so forth. So I think this is what needs to happen. And as long as the EU continues on this track of, penalizing or trying to penalize Turkey for some of the, diplomatic maneuvers that is not to its liking, we fall back into this trap of basically failing to build a relationship that is anything but a transactional relationship, and as a result of which what is likely to happen a few years down the road is that this trend of seeing, an important country, a neighbor like Turkey, moving away from soft power to hard power, that is the trend that the EU is likely to cement through its own mistakes. And I think this is where I want to end.
Thank you very much, Sinan. Damon, we've been already starting a discussion about United States withdrawal from the Eastern Mediterranean and the globe in general. So what is your take on the American foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean under the Trump administration? And my follow-up question would be, would the elections matter? So would a Biden administration mean a fundamental shift in America's view of the Eastern Mediterranean?
Sure, thank you. First of all, let me say how pleased I am that the Delphi Economic Forum is moving forward virtually, and how pleased I am to be joining again this year. And let me also begin this conversation with a dose of humility. My country right now is going through a really tough time. A tough time that it's easy for foreign observers to say, how is the United States even relevant to what's happening in a place like the Eastern Mediterranean? And so I do come to this with a sense of humility, because if we're going to lead globally, if we're going to be an example of inspiration in the world, we have to fix ourselves at home. The United States has historically been influential in the world because our society, the way we work, has been a source of inspiration. Our values, our commitment to freedom, have been what have actually magnified our power. It's not just that hard power, it's amplified by the soft power of the example. And so first and foremost, any conversation about the United States and the Eastern Mediterranean has to begin with a sense of humility, that we're at a low point right now. But one thing I do know is that we're structured in a way that our systems are open, they retain legitimacy because of our people, and we are a self-correcting system. We don't need others to tell us where our shortcomings are, although that's the wrenching debate we're having right now. And I say that because that's ultimately a source of our strength. And so the United States' role in the Eastern Mediterranean is a strangely countervailing set of circumstances. In many respects, at a strategic level, we have one of the most coherent approaches to the Eastern Mediterranean that you could argue has been articulated by a foreign policy community in quite a few decades. But at the same time, many of you have already noted on this panel, there is a glaring sense of absence and perhaps irrelevance to some of the biggest issues unfolding. So let me unpack that briefly. I think the history of this region, the United States, is deeply embedded and committed. It is because of coming out of 1945, the Turkish state's crisis, the Greek Civil War, that led to America's role in the world, the Truman Doctrine, that catalyzed the creation of NATO, and that through a bold decision of American leadership to bring Greece and Turkey into the alliance, transformed the way that Southeast Europe played out during the Cold War in a really remarkable way. And so the zone of geostrategic competition isn't new for this region, but it has returned. It's returned beginning in 2014 in Crimea, the Russian presence in the Black Sea, in 2015 in Syria, and how that has just metastasized into one of the worst tragedies facing our planet. We've seen Russian-Chinese cooperation, a Chinese presence in the Mediterranean, and we've seen some increasing concerns around issues of non-proliferation, migratory flows, WMD. We've had incidents where the U.S. has been engaged very much so in trying to control the flow of weapons of mass destruction or illicit flows in the region. These are real issues. Despite the perception of the United States not being there, we've actually seen a pretty remarkable apogee in U.S.-Greek relations over the past decade, growing out of the sense of despair in Greece, first of all, during the financial crisis, but something that's really been bipartisan in Greece and really bipartisan in the United States to put the relationship in one of the strongest footings we've had ever. We've also seen a real commitment here at a strategic level on understanding how we need to have a stronger strategic anchor among the democracies in the region. You've seen very explicit efforts. You've seen an East Med strategy even from this administration with Wes Mitchell, who drove it when he was in office, of really stepping up coordination with Greece, the Republic of Cyprus, Israel, paralleled and accompanied with a real commitment to retaining and keeping Turkey as an ally and as part of the strategic West. It's a plagued issue, it's a troubled issue, it's a troubled relationship. It's faced tensions, obviously, first and foremost in Syria, but elsewhere. But it has remained part of what's unfolding. So we see these countervailing forces. The fundamental ones are big picture. President Trump building on even an expression of President Obama of ending the wars, where you see an instinct of restraint at the political level, which means we don't really want to own the problem in Syria or own the problem in Libya. There's an intentional backing away from American responsibility for those, with an expectation that regional actors and the European Union have responsibility first and foremost, and that our role could be supporting. You've seen the sense of energy sufficiency and independence in the United States also help underscore that there is a lessened dependence of the United States on the broader region in economic and energy terms. And yet at the same time, we've seen overwhelming bipartisan support for an East Med Act, for a power projection capability which is unparalleled. It's not as if we've left Suda Bay. Our drone operations in Greece, our naval operations in Crete. Incirlik is a pillar of American power projection, Aviano in Italy, along with probably the most developed security cooperation we've had, not only with Greece, but Israel, with Egypt, and especially what is a new caliber, the Republic of Cyprus, and a real commitment from the new OPIC, the Overseas Development Finance Corporation, to look to put billions of dollars into the region in a way that can catalyze private sector investment. So we're a mess. We don't have strategic clarity. We've lost some moral leadership right now. Our elections will matter. Vice President Biden knows this region well. Look at his team, from Tony Blinken to Nick Burns. They know this region well. And so we're going to be distracted. This will not be our first priority. The burden will be on your shoulders, on the region's shoulders, on the European Union. But it would be short-sighted to count us out, even as it would be misplaced to depend on us. You can see the elements of a strategy that could come together, and I'll close with this. That would be a recommitment after we get through this year, our elections, on how we keep the alliance with Turkey strong, working with a common goal with Greece to keep Turkey in the strategic West in that partnership, how to continue to bolster democracies in a coordinated way against autocracies, working with Greece, Republic of Cyprus, Israel, how to continue to advance new solutions on the island of Cyprus, and how to multilateralize the framework in the Eastern Mediterranean around economic and energy, and around the security issues of proliferation, migration, weapons of mass destruction, illicit flows, which really do matter. So there's space that we can come back to this with a strategic entry, but it just won't happen in the next couple of weeks and months, that's for sure.
Thank you very much, Damon. I think a very important point you raised is the need to multilateralize the discussion and the sort of addressing the issues and the conflicts in a way that is inclusive and not exclusive, and in a way that can involve as many actors as possible in the region, and those global actors interested in the region, depending on their domestic, of course, situation as well. But as you've already, all of you have raised, in the short term, the managing the economic effects of the crisis and the pandemic itself is likely to be a priority. So I would like to hear your very short comment on how things could develop in the realm of economy, which I think is the first emergency that everybody is facing right now. So Turkey has been very vulnerable, like there have been all these discussions about how to meet its foreign debt obligations. Greece and Turkey are fundamentally influenced by tourism flows. So like the expected like the expected decrease in tourism revenue is going to affect them. And of course, the European Union is facing a major challenge in order to help the countries that have been fundamentally and stronger affected by the crisis in a way that doesn't destroy the internal structure and the solidarity within the member states. So, Thanos, what do you think is Greece's first priority in that respect?
Well, first of all, we expect some clarifications about the EU's package. Everyone is hoping that there will be generous terms. I suspect this is also an issue of high interest for Italy as well. So this is one of the priorities. What will be the terms and how to use that money as wisely and efficiently as possible. Number two is, of course, as you mentioned, Ioannis, tourism. And I suspect, and that goes for Turkey as well, I think the last thing we would need is to scare away those tourists that still intend to travel during the summer by raising the tensions in the Aegean and the Eastern Med. So I think that both countries would benefit from a calm summer extending to fall. And then, of course, I take Nathalie's point about regional globalization. Perhaps if this is going to be the case, we need to explore prospects for economic cooperation in the sub-region. No specific ideas, but I think this is something worth exploring in the weeks and months to come.
Sinan, do you think that the economic situation in Turkey is going to affect the Turkish foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean? Because you've mentioned how domestic opinion matters now, right? So I suspect that that would be a very important point to follow.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, on the surface, one could claim that, as countries get into economic hardship, they look to divert attention towards, foreign policy challenges. So that could be the outcome for Turkey as well. But I would argue that this is not, an inevitable consequence. If you want to be a bit more intellectual about it rather than superficial, I could claim that here there's an opportunity for the EU actually, because what is happening in the EU countries, but also in the neighborhood, is an unprecedented economic shock, and we are seeing some very substantive increases in unemployment, in decreases in welfare. And this is definitely an area where, in a post-COVID environment, the EU could also restructure its economic commitments to. And this would be one way of rebuilding the type of leverage that I've tried to underline at the beginning, and rebuilding the type of, positive agenda between Turkey and the EU. And this should not certainly be focalized or centralized on Turkey, but there will be a need for many other countries in the Eastern Mediterranean for this type of approach. The second, perhaps, theme that I want to underline very briefly is this regional deglobalization or regional globalization. Indeed, we do hear and read a lot about the fact that companies now want to diversify away from China. They want to build more resilient supply chains, and therefore, Europe's neighborhood could indeed be a beneficiary of this trend. Especially countries like Turkey that has a vast industrial infrastructure. But here as well, I think this is not going to happen on its own, and there is a need for deeper thinking among the policy elites in the EU about what is it that they want to do to facilitate this trend, and what is the role for public action in this type of objective, because fundamentally these are market players. So it is ultimately up to them to decide whether they want to do, to continue their large-scale investments in China. But obviously, there's a role for public policy if there is indeed a goal of trying to transfer some of those investments to regions that are much closer to Europe. And that could also be yet another area where the Turkey-EU relationship could find new strength.
Thank you very much, Sinan. We have about 2 minutes left, so I would like to apologize from Damon and give the last floor to Nathalie on a very short comment on how the EU has been faring through the crisis.
Very briefly. I would say that if we compare to the Eurozone crisis, which is our, if you like, last point of reference, the EU has been doing incomparably better. Now, you could say it doesn't take much, and I would agree with that. But indeed, after a slow start, when it comes to the EU's internal response, meaning response to itself, it's quite clear that we're sort of putting in place not only significant bridging mechanisms from the 750 billion of the European Central Bank, the SURE program, the European Investment Bank program, the reformed European Stability Mechanism, and above all, moving towards what could eventually, if we end up being good at negotiating this, a very ambitious, now called Next Generation EU Recovery and Resilience Program. That would amount to, as per proposal of the European Commission, 750 billion, 500 billion of which in grants. Now, extremely significant when it comes to the inside. Now, the problem, of course, is that the economic crisis does not stop at the Schengen borders. And so the question really is, how can the EU also pay as much attention to the outside, to its nation, especially in the players are unlikely to do so, as we were discussing. Very difficult to do the drone, and this is why I come back to the multilateral, which is actually something that the EU is relatively good at doing. The question is, in my view, not only what the EU will be able to do bilaterally with neighboring regions, and here I completely agree with the points Sinan was making, but the extent to which it's going to be able to mobilize multilateral forums, such for instance the G20, to more effect in coordinating a socio-economic response to the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nathalie. And I would like to thank all panelists for their input into a very interesting discussion. And I would like also to thank the Delphi Economic Forum for inviting me to moderate this discussion. And I look forward to seeing you in person when conditions permit. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ioannis.